Hello, everyone. This is Forum Communications Director Mark Sommerhauser, and welcome to our Forum Friday event on pandemic recovery in Wisconsin's arts and cultural sector. We are going to give just a couple more minutes for any of our remaining guests to trickle in here. So please sit tight, and we will get this program underway here in just a couple minutes. Well, hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Sommerhauser, Communications Director and Researcher with the Wisconsin Policy Forum. And on behalf of the forum, I'd like to welcome you to another installment of our virtual policy discussion series, Forum Friday. This is an event we launched back in 2020, early in the pandemic. We shed new light on an issue we recently covered in our research, bring in guests for the Q&A, and also field your questions about the topic at hand. Just a very quick word here about the forum. We're a statewide, nonpartisan, independent policy research organization based in Milwaukee and Madison. Our work is supported by hundreds of corporations, nonprofits, local governments, school districts, and individuals throughout the state of Wisconsin. It's a diverse group, but all of our supporters value data-driven, objective research to inform public policy, as well as thoughtful, nuanced, fact-based policy discussion. These things are increasingly hard to find amid the deep polarization of our current times. We'd also like to acknowledge the sponsors of today's program, and they are Brookfield-based Community Care, which serves the long-term care and health needs of more than 12,000 older adults and adults with physical or intellectual disabilities across 15 counties. With 24 offices globally, including Madison and Milwaukee, Foley and Lardner seeks to understand their clients' priorities, objectives, and challenges to provide them with successful outcomes. And thank you also to the Zilber Family Foundation for their support for today's program. And just a very quick word for the strongest supporters of the forum, our pillars of public policy. And those are A.O. Smith, BMO Harris Bank, Northwestern Mutual, Potawatomi Hotel and Casino, Rockwell Automation, Spectrum, and We Energies. And thank you also to our Sentinels of Civil Conduct, which are Johnson Controls and Von Briesen and Roper SC. And with that, we'd like to get our Forum Friday program underway. We'll get to our guests here in just a few moments, but first, as we do with every Forum Friday, we're going to try to frame this conversation with a brief presentation on some of our recent research. And Forum Senior Researcher Joe Pietrangelo is joining us. He's going to briefly go over some of that research to kind of get the discussion rolling. So with that, Joe, take it away.
All right, thanks, Mark. So I will jump in right away and share a few slides covering some of the key findings from our recent study, starting with a look at employment trends. So we used the most accurate data available from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and looked at total employment by month in Wisconsin in 3 economic subsectors that are most closely tied to arts and culture. So those are the performing arts, spectator sports, and related industries subsector, which also includes independent artists, musicians, writers, etc. The museums, historical sites, and similar industries subsector, and the motion, picture, and sound recording industry subsector, which does include movie theaters. And we're also showing here the employment trend for all industries. So you can see how the arts and culture subsectors have fared relative to the economy overall. As you can see, employment figures in all 3 arts and culture subsectors really plummeted at the onset of the pandemic in April 2020 and remained deeply depressed throughout that year. There was considerable recovery in 2021, but as of December, employment totals were still well below pre-pandemic levels and lagging the overall economy. There was also a bit of a plateau in employment in at least 2 of the 3 subsectors in the 4th quarter of 2021, and it is still unclear whether there has been additional employment recovery in 2022. Unfortunately, there's about a 6-month lag in these data, but it is the best source we have because other data sources do not allow us to look at employment trends at this level of detail and accuracy. So we also looked at data on state sales tax revenues, and that as reported by businesses, and that showed a similar trend. This chart shows the quarterly sales tax revenues for the 3 arts and culture subsectors combined, which were far below 2019 levels throughout 2020 and into 2021. There was a major recovery in the 2nd and 3rd quarters of 2021, but in the 4th quarter of 2021 and 1st quarter of 2022, there were declines, and revenues in those 2 quarters again fell short of 2019 levels. Focusing in on the 1st quarter of this year, which is the most recent quarter for which complete preliminary data are available, we found sales tax revenues were down in all 3 arts and culture subsectors relative to 2019 levels. And that contrasted with the overall state sales tax revenues, which were up by nearly 24% over 2019 levels. And that was largely driven by strong growth in the retail sector. So perhaps the most positive finding in our analysis is that most arts and cultural organizations and businesses in Wisconsin seem to have survived the worst part of the pandemic. This chart is showing data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics on the number of establishments in each of the 3 arts and culture subsectors by quarter. And as of the 4th quarter of 2021, there were roughly as many, if not more, establishments in each subsector as there had been in the 4th quarter of 2019. But it will be important to continue to track these numbers to determine whether arts and cultural establishments survive over the longer term. Our research also delved into how federal pandemic relief funding stemming from the CARES Act and American Rescue Plan Act played a large role in helping to keep many arts and cultural organizations and businesses going. Altogether, a total of roughly $440 million was distributed to arts and cultural establishments in our state. That funding came through a number of different programs, starting with the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP, which provided over 3,000 loans totaling just over $119 million to arts and cultural establishments in Wisconsin. And here you can see how that funding was distributed to different types of organizations and businesses. In addition to, sorry, go back, Jeff, to that previous slide. In addition to PPP, the other largest federal relief program was the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant Program, which provided a total of $221 million in grants to performing arts venue operators. Those businesses could qualify for grants covering 45% of their 2019 gross earned revenue with a maximum grant amount of $10 million. The state of Wisconsin also created several programs that specifically targeted or at least supported arts and cultural establishments in Wisconsin with grants or loans using federal pandemic relief funding that the state had received. And based on the data available when we published our report in April, Wisconsin had allocated more of its federal funds than average nationally toward businesses and employers, including those in arts and culture. So that contrasts with how the state of Wisconsin compares with other states in its ongoing annual support for arts and culture. This chart shows that Wisconsin dedicated about 14 cents per capita to arts and culture in budget year 2022, which ranked 49th of the 50 states. And Wisconsin has consistently ranked 50th, or in this case, 49th. And this is funding the state dedicated to the Wisconsin Arts Board. By contrast, Michigan provides 7 times as much in per capita state funding to arts and culture, which is roughly the national median of about $1 per capita, while Minnesota ranks near the top nationally at well over $7 per capita. For Wisconsin to move up to the median among US states, it would need to raise the annual amount it dedicates to arts and culture from less than $1 million per year to at least $5 million per year. So I will leave it there. I hope this provides a solid base for our conversation on the state of recovery for arts and culture in Wisconsin. And I'll turn it back over to Mark now to continue our program. You're still on mute, Mark.
Thank you. All right. Thanks for the presentation, Joe. A lot to digest there, but we saw obviously a lot of progress from where we were in 2020, but still some ground to cover clearly as your data shows. And we're going to talk to our guests next about kind of their view on what we have in front of us here. So I'd like to introduce the first of our guests. We're just going to do a one-on-one discussion with him first and then bring on our other 2 guests after that. So George Zugros is Executive Director of the Wisconsin Arts Board, the state agency that nurtures creativity, cultivates expression, promotes the arts, supports arts and education, and serves as a resource for people of every culture and heritage. We're delighted to have you with us today, George. Thank you for being with us.
Glad to be here, Mark. Thank you.
Okay. Well, let's just get right into it here. And I'll start with a question that I think, dovetails pretty nicely from Joe's report that came out a few months ago and maybe gives us a little bit of an update as to where we stand now. Obviously, as Joe was just explaining, our research showed employment in the arts kind of rebounding, sizably in 2021, but still remaining below pre-pandemic levels. And certainly within the arts and cultural sectors, a lot of variation. It's not monolithic, and there are some that have rebounded quite strongly and others that have not so much. Now that we're much further now into 2022, I'm just curious to kind of get an update from you in terms of what you're seeing, what you're hearing in terms of, particularly as it relates to employment in the arts. Are we seeing a further rebound, or is it just kind of, stuck more or less where it was at the end of 2021? What are you hearing?
It'll be interesting to see what the numbers tell us, but the stories that are told are about people who have left the sector during the pandemic to find other employment because they were in search of benefits they may not have had already in the positions that they held. And then there's the shortage of people to fill roles, whether those people are paid employees or volunteers. Both of those sectors have not come bouncing back as we had hoped, because again, some of it is people have decided they want to work in different ways. Some people have enjoyed the hybrid work of being at home rather than being in an office. Some have taken their skills, carpenters, electricians, and others, to other industries where they could monetize them some more. So I think it's going to remain to be seen where the comebacks are, and how things will settle out. But I would say going forward, we're still watching very closely to see the return of people who will be working in the industry.
Interesting. And just as a follow-up there, what is kind of the variation or what are some of the distinctions you're drawing within the arts and cultural sector? Because as we mentioned with employment, when you break down arts and culture into these subsectors, we see very radically different things happening. What are some of the distinctions you think are important to bear in mind kind of within arts and culture in terms of maybe some subsectors that are doing better, some that are still face more challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting question. So, for example, you go to a movie theater now, and you're lucky if you find a couple people there ready to not only take your ticket, but provide you with the concessions that you would hope to see, and the people who would be guiding you to the movie theater. So, again, it's a competition for those young workers who have chosen to do other things over the summer. So that's one example. I think what we're also seeing, we're talking about the people who've maybe chosen different paths. There are also people who have chosen their way to retirement, right? So this was the time that people said, I think it's time to hang it up, or there may be something else I'd like to do, and so they've hung it up in that way as well. So I think I'd let our future guests here go a little further and deeper into the differentiation that you're talking about.
Sounds good. I do want to talk a little bit about just kind of attendance and participation in the arts. Clearly, we saw that just absolutely plummet in 2020, somewhat of a bounce back in 21. But, we unfortunately are not fully clear of this pandemic yet, and we've seen a recent uptick in cases. Some of what we're hearing suggests that is continuing to perhaps have some impact, at least at the margins, on attendance and participation. What is your sense of what impact the virus is continuing to have, and B, what other factors in addition to the virus might be, continuing to kind of hold down participation and attendance below those pre-pandemic levels?
Sure. I mean, the pandemic is primary in the thought as people are purchasing tickets. We were talking before we started the webinar that in Madison, the mayor has now closed down the city building to the public, right? So we're going back into that moment where we're protecting ourselves by not having the public in. But our audiences are making later decisions, right? Because they're making decisions based on where they think the pandemic's going to be when they decide to purchase their tickets. And the kinds of restrictions they might find in the audience when they get there, whether they have to be masked, whether they have to show some form of vaccination, those things are making people hesitant to sign up. So, the pandemic is one thing. Inflation has got us both as a ticket buyer and the costs that have gone up for our arts organizations, so buying materials, supply chain issues that have driven costs up. Those are things that have happened as well. But and for the person who's purchasing the ticket, they're making decisions for their family, what they're going to spend their money on. So those are a couple things that are, in fact, keeping audiences depressed, shall we say, as far as the numbers are concerned.
Yeah, inflation is a great point, and that's one I think we're going to talk about with our other guests here in a little while. But we know that's having a big impact for the organizations, and as you're saying, for the individuals and families that are making decisions about whether to attend an event.
Yeah.
Talking a little more about our research, we obviously go in quite a bit in detail in terms of the very considerable impact of the more than $440 million in federal relief funding that did go to arts and cultural organizations in Wisconsin. That I think was clearly a big part of the picture in 2021. Organizations supported by those dollars were able to make some progress toward recovery from what happened in 2020. But it seems like we are probably approaching a key threshold here where those one-time funds are going to run out. And our research estimated sometime either in this year or the next, for most organizations, those dollars would run out, and then we would reach a new phase where they're no longer being sustained by those dollars. At what point in your mind do you think we're going to cross that threshold? I'm sure it varies from one organization to another, but kind of most importantly, how can we ensure that these organizations are on fiscally sustainable ground moving forward?
Well, that's a great question. I think first of all, it's happening, as you say, at various times for different organizations. We've got to start with a thank you, right? We've got to start with the thank you that through the federal government, through state government, dollars were put forward, not only just to the arts organizations, but to artists themselves to support them through the COVID period, right? So you got to say thank you for that, because to your research, had that not been the case, I'm not sure we would have seen the numbers at the end of the period studied that we saw. We would have seen more organizations gone away and more artists leaving the field. So starting with a thank you and then acknowledging that we're going to be in a situation where it's going to be a world of hurt because those federal dollars aren't there anymore. And so as we go forward, what do we rely on? We rely on ticket prices. Well, obviously, we've just talked about tickets being depressed as far as the number of audience members coming because of COVID, inflation, and other reasons. It's all about, on top of that, it's earned and contributed income. So our connections to our patrons as contributors to the bottom line of the organizations, they too went out of their way to make sure that the organizations were healthy as they went through the pandemic. And let's acknowledge the creativity of the arts administrators and the artists who made that connection continue. So that's another piece of the puzzle as we go forward. But how much slack can that group take up when the government has now gone away? And you guys rightly acknowledge the fact that Wisconsin does not invest in the arts at the level that it should, as it relates to our wonderful artists and our extraordinary arts organizations. The investment of Wisconsin should be far greater than it is right now through the State Arts Board. So all of those things kind of create a perfect storm of where are the resources coming from as the organizations and artists make their way through this period.
How concerned are you about this next step for arts and cultural organizations? It seems like a pretty precarious time as they think about how to move forward with no longer being able to rely on these federal dollars. The pandemic, obviously many people have been vaccinated and so forth, but the pandemic kind of continued to linger out there. Where's your level of concern right now about as you kind of look out over the next couple of years?
I think it's a concern, a great concern, because there are people who believe that the arts got all the money they needed through the CARES Act, through the American Rescue Plan, and therefore everybody's whole, everybody's healthy, that's it, we don't have to worry about it anymore. Well, nothing could be further from the truth, and we've already talked about why. And so as we're looking forward, that story has to be told more robustly to the general public, to our patrons, and to others, to say the organizations you care about and the artists you care about need your support now more than ever. And that support can come in a number of ways. Financial, yes, definitely. Volunteerism, yes, definitely. When we think about the fact that many of our volunteers are on the older edge of the spectrum, also the kinds of folks who are affected by COVID in different ways and may choose not to be around, that's a whole contribution that's made, right? A volunteer contributes their time, and maybe we're not paying for the thing that they're contributing for because they're there and volunteering. Well, if they're not there and volunteering, we're going to pay more. So yeah, it's going to be a tough time ahead. It's going to take extreme creativity, but most importantly, it's going to mean all of us in the arts, again, thanking people for the resources that we've received, but understanding going forward, there's going to need to be a greater investment in the things that we all learned during the pandemic that people craved, right? We wanted to get out. We wanted to get out and see theater. We wanted to be in the concert hall, etc. But those things are not magic, and they're not free. They cost money. They take investment, and it's up to us and our colleagues throughout the state to continue to bang that drum.
Let's segue a bit from that, because yes, one of the themes certainly of our research here was that we have seen Wisconsin actually draw more heavily than many other states on the American Rescue Plan funds. Its allotment, Wisconsin's allotment, has gone disproportionately to support the arts and culture. But again, of course, and that has had a big impact, but those, of course, are one-time dollars. And when we look at ongoing year in and year out support, for public funding support for arts and culture, Wisconsin is very near the bottom of all 50 states. What is the case you would make, number one, of why public funding for the arts matters, even for people who are not patrons of the arts? And what, if any, opportunity do you see to really be able to organize a coalition that could make the case to kind of move that needle in a meaningful way?
Well, I would say that many people may not see themselves as part of the arts, but they're obviously using a smaller family picture of what the arts are than I would. I just today in the Wisconsin Arts News that we put out, they were talking about a music festival in Toma that's been happening for 15 years. If you're out there at the music festival, it's likely you're taking it in for free. However, it was paid for somehow, right? It was paid for by patrons. It was paid for by the city in some cases, et cetera. So even if you think you're not participating, you are participating in something that has been touched by the artist, the musician, et cetera. And so that's one piece. The second piece is it's extraordinarily crucial for this moment in time we're in, where we're trying to lure people in from other industries. We're trying to get creative and talented workers here. We're trying to keep the entrepreneurs here and have them doing their work. And that creativity that comes from the arts is so very crucial. So what's the coalition? The coalition, first of all, our great friends at Create Wisconsin are out there banging that drum on a regular basis. But it's people who are from the grassroots, the mom and pops on Main Street, and it's the grass tops. It's the titans of industry. It's the people who are supporting organizations through their board service and their contributions through checks. So it's got to be all folks who support this for whatever their reason. Personal, I want to perform in the community theater, so therefore I want to make sure the community theater is there, or I want to bring in a doctor who's going to serve my community, and there better be something there for them. Otherwise, they're going to choose to go and move somewhere else.
Is there an opportunity that you would see, George, to be able to organize a coalition that could really make the case, whether it's to lawmakers, it could be at the local level as well, to policymakers at the local level, to really meaningfully make a shift in terms of budget priorities going toward funding arts and culture?
Yeah, I do think that that's still possible. Mark, we're turning 50 this year. In 2023, the Arts Board comes 50 years old. We don't want to be 50th in the United States when we turn 50. And so to do that, we do have to have the coalition of artists and arts organizations, community members, and leaders coming together to do that. And I do think that's a very strong possibility, because I think the legislature hasn't heard that message in as clear a way from as many different people as it could. And so we look forward to that opportunity to see the coalitions coming together and making that effort. So
certainly a relevant point here with the state, having very large levels of budget surplus to be interesting to see that discussion play out here for the next year leading up to the next state budget. So
it does not escape us that when we have such a grand $3 billion or more budget surplus, that the Arts Board is at a level that is that low in its investment. And so it's time, especially as we talk about at the time of the creative economy, we should be celebrating those who are the best in creativity, whether that's in the arts or in the sciences, and raising them up and into view. At this moment, we don't have the resource to be doing that in the way that, as I said before, is supportive of and celebrates the artists and arts organizations in our state. And we'll look forward to that coalition helping us move to that place.
Very good. Thank you very much for fielding these questions, George. We're going to bring on our additional two guests, and
Great.
While we'll have you turn off your video now, if you want to stick around, and you can rejoin us for the Q&A portion here in about 15 minutes. And I would like to also just take a moment right now to encourage our audience to, if you have questions in mind right now, don't wait. Please submit them now rather than later. It's helpful to us. We have a few staffers here behind the scenes who are helping us kind of get these questions in order. But if you have a question in mind, just go click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, submit the question, And that way, hopefully we can have a handful of these already in the queue so we can get going right away when we start the Q&A portion. But next, I would like to introduce our additional two guests. David Lee is CEO of Imagine MKE, which is the convener, connector, and amplifier of the arts and culture community in Milwaukee. It's a diverse network of arts, civic, and business leaders is united to advance arts and culture as a catalyst for social and economic vitality in Milwaukee. Welcome, David. And Patrick Rath.
Thanks so much. Sorry, I wanted to make sure I was off mute.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and Patrick Rath is the president and CEO of United Performing Arts Fund, which operates in Eastern Wisconsin and beyond to fund 40 diverse local performing arts organizations. UPAF engages the community to support 14 performing arts members, including First Stage, Florentine Opera Company, Milwaukee Ballet, Milwaukee Repertory Theater, Milwaukee Symphony Orchestra, and Skylight Music Theater, as well as numerous affiliates. Patrick, it's great to have you.
Thank you, Mark. Glad to be here.
Yes. So let's get to it here, and we're just excited to hear from your perspective. Obviously, maybe having a little more of a Southeast Wisconsin bent than George did, but what? And this first question, actually, I would love to have both of you take a crack at. Patrick, if you want to start, and then David. Just in the Milwaukee area and in Southeast Wisconsin, what are you seeing and hearing in terms of this big question that was kind of the subject of our report, employment in the arts and cultural sectors? Obviously, our report came out back in April. We're now approaching August. What have you seen and heard on this front here in 2022?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. First, I want to thank the Public Policy Forum for coming together and really looking at the arts sector. I think the report that was published a few months back, and it was noted in the Q&A from Chad Bauman, the managing director for the Milwaukee Repertory Theater, the performing arts is a subset of what was looked upon as the other ticketed activities in our state, which is the private concert venues as well as the sporting venues in our communities. The unique thing about the performing arts is we rely heavily on contributed income. And with that, the recovery in terms of people's hesitancy to return has been much greater for the performing arts in those venues versus some of the sports activities that people were able to come back to that routine much more quickly. So what we see from that report, we actually see a significantly worse picture that we've experienced in that time frame, but also as we go forward here. So just a few data points for that perspective. The 14 members of UPAF, as you referenced, Mark, they've lost a combined $38 million in total revenue since the start of the pandemic in May of 2020 through the end of their seasons here at the end of 2022. So that's really fresh data as of the last month. That $38 million revenue loss was dollars that could never be recovered again because they were in real time. These were people who were buying tickets and making other contributions. And so when tickets are down, contributions are down at the same time. So all of this has created really what was a perfect storm of unintended fiscal fallout for all of our member organizations. And so a couple other things that has happened since that point in time. You referenced government support. And what's happened through either PPP, the SFOG grant program, the CARES Act, and then certainly we look forward to ARPA funding being a part of that picture as well. That was roughly about $25 million of funding coming back into the sector, but much of it was to make up for what was looked upon as a one-season loss. That time frame from 2020 into 2021. What wasn't taken into account was the real impact as we continued the pandemic effects through 21 and 2022. So we're still at a negative loss of over $11 to $12 million through this time frame. And what's even more really glaring at us right now is what we call it a financial cliff. Because last year, just to operate, there was roughly $15 million of one-time government support to just keep those doors open. That was roughly 25% of all our members' budgets. So that money is gone for next season. It does not exist any further. And with that, what we see is so many of our members right now are trying to find ways to cover this gap. They don't have the long-term resources to do so. We don't have that substantial public support that we see. And at the same time, we still have this incredible audience hesitancy. We just looked at our numbers from our members. And prior to the pandemic, there'd be about 500,000 individuals who would purchase tickets to enjoy one of the performances of our member organizations. Well, last year, that number was around 360,000 individuals. That's a drop of 30% still. But a lot of people, they're saying, well, the pandemic's over. It's not. It's realized in these numbers. Well, that's an equal to about $5 to $6 million of lost ticket revenue as well, that the doors were open, people were just not able to come back. So there's more points that I can make on this. I'm sure we'll cover more, especially when we talk about the workforce and what we have to do to address this. But the probably the worst year from the pandemic from a fiscal survival standpoint is probably what we're looking at in the season ahead out of these past 3 years.
And I want to let David address this question, but real quick, Patrick, just to kind of follow up on that, because, I asked George, when do we hit that point where we're kind of crossing that threshold where the federal dollars are no longer playing this role of sustaining these organizations? They're going to have to move ahead and find a way to be sustainable without that relief funding. It sounds like you're saying for a lot of what you're seeing and hearing these organizations, that time is now, right? That they're
For the performing arts, it's now.
Yeah.
And one of the realities of performing arts, you can't really scale what you do from an arts production standpoint. You have to be able to have people on stage. You need people behind the scenes, creating that environment, making that magic come alive. It's a very large human capital resource that you have to do. So it doesn't matter if you put 1 or 2 people on stage or if you put 20 people on stage, you have so much background infrastructure to create that. So the arts can't necessarily scale to be able to say we can find a path through expense reduction. What, quite frankly, expense reduction is ceasing or stopping those productions at whole. It doesn't mean to scale it. And that's what we're facing, I think, in the next year or so if we can't see this rebound, especially from audience standpoint and public support at the same time.
interesting and concerning. Want to pivot to you, David. What's your thought on what, kind of the update moving forward from when our report came out to what you've seen so far this year?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And Patrick, I think, really outlined some of the very real and present challenges of the performing arts segment of this broader sort of arts and cultural sector, including the creative industries, is facing, right? And I just want to zoom out really quickly because I know you all reach folks from around the state. But one point that George didn't mention is that throughout the state, according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis and the National Endowment for the Arts, Wisconsin's creative and cultural sector, which includes performing arts, cultural institutions, and creatives and artists across the board, contributed around $9.6 billion to our state economy, representing about 3% of our state GDP, which would put us in the top 4 of our state's industries, along with retail, construction, transportation. In Milwaukee, at last count, and this is an older data point, that's about 12,000 jobs and $2.7 billion in annual wages, which is humongous, right? That's pretty big. And so if you even carve a little bit deeper, a little bit more segmented into just the nonprofit arts and culture groups, which includes the performing arts groups, the museums, all those folks, they generate about $250 million in annual spend, which, as Joe reported, generates all kinds of tax revenue and other benefits for the state and down to us, right? That is not nothing. And by the way, as George outlined, we're 58th or last in the nation in public funding for the arts, right? So we generate as a sector, we generate all of this stuff. We get very little back. And I think that is a real thing that we have to grapple with as a community, right? Because Milwaukee has an incredible arts and culture ecosystem. I think anybody you talk to will talk about how Milwaukee's arts and culture ecosystem is, one of the best kept secrets in the Great Lakes region, one of the reasons why people come here. And I got to say that, hearing George talk, hearing Patrick talk, having this ecosystem forever is not a foregone conclusion, right? We are facing very real challenges as a sector, and it is going to it's going to require our community to come together to support this sector through this dark time, right? Because I think the conversation a little bit earlier was, how might we build a coalition to support the arts and culture sector? I think what's really important is that the public, right, supports industries that benefit the public, like roads, electricity, all that stuff, right? Our electrical grid. People move here for things to do, right? People move here because we have an incredible art museum, because We have a really important repertory theater. We have a symphony. We have a ballet. We have a regionally important film cultural institution here. We have all of the things that makes a city like ours compete with other larger places. And I think that's something that we forget about, right? And I think that is something that we have to remind people that there's actually something at risk here. And just one last thought before moving on, I was reminded of a conversation I had with actually a handful of conversations I had with elected officials at the beginning of the pandemic, when we were beginning this call for establishing a public emergency fund for arts and culture. And not just one, but many of them asked, how do we justify supporting arts and culture when we have to support the food bank and all the sort of basic needs issues that people are dealing with right now? And my answer was, when you're supporting the arts, quote unquote, you're not supporting buildings, right? You're supporting people. You're supporting people who work there, who produce the work, who not only act on the stages, but also build the sets, do all of the stuff that make this industry work. And I think for us to really begin to think about our industry, our sector as an industry, I think is really, really important.
Thank you, David. Some really interesting stuff here. We'll delve into it a little more here. But do just want to make another quick plug. We're seeing some questions trickle in now through the Q&A, but it's always great to get as many of those queued up heading into the Q&A portion as we can. So again, for our audience, if you have questions in mind, or some of this good discussion is kind of stimulating any questions in your mind, please do click that Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen and submit that, so we can take that in and have it ready to go. I want to bounce back to Patrick real quick. You mentioned this concern with attendance in the performing arts still not being at or close to pre-pandemic levels. What is your assessment of what factors are at play there? Clearly the pandemic and just, concerns that individuals might have about going out in public, especially when virus case levels are higher, as they have been increasing recently. Clearly that's part of it. How much of it is that in your mind versus are there other factors in addition to that are also at play here in terms of affecting people's decision to go to a play or a concert or an exhibit or what have you? What's your take there?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Certainly, audience hesitancy takes into a lot of factors, one of which is, like you said, was caseloads rise, and we've been seeing this through the national data. It's not about hospitalizations, it's about case rising. There is then general public concern, and people modify their behaviors at that point in time, especially an older adult population, which is typically drawn to a lot of the arts and cultural sector. We also see a couple other things too. Group sales. I think this has been reported by everything from the Milwaukee Brewers and Summerfest, including our own organizations. It's down significantly. And this is when businesses would have planned those gatherings, those get-togethers. That's not happening at the level it once did. Couple that with the fact that much of I'll use downtown Milwaukee, we're still at about 1 out of 3 employees who used to work downtown on a Monday through Friday basis are back in the office. Which means their routines now are much different. They're home-based routines. And now it's a question of, when do you come out for the arts? When do you close that laptop and say, I'm coming into Milwaukee to do that, versus when you were already there to experience it and do that with family and friends. So all these routines have not come back to a sense of normalcy yet. We also haven't seen that hesitancy overcome. What I will say is that in the month of May in particular, we started to see some really good examples of people excited to be back in the theaters. In particular, I think we were really at a low point compared to January when we had Omicron and those other variants. May was a much different time frame in caseloads. And so the Milwaukee Ballet, the Milwaukee Rep, the Skylight Music Theater, they were all seeing nearly sold out performances during those timeframes. They also had incredible content that they were producing and putting on stage. The one negative during that time frame was still the fear of canceling performances. And so when a performance gets canceled, like it happened for the run of Titanic, which was exceptional, and it's going to be coming back in the fall for the Milwaukee Rep, they lost 15 performances. And during that time frame, they had to refund tickets, but they still had the costs associated with all those production activities. And so you have questions then of audience attendees and saying, well, do I want to do a subscription? Do I want to do this Flex Pass? I'm not sure if I'm going to get there if it has to be closed down again. All what this does is it actually creates more cost for our members at the same time. They have to get more of those understudies. They have to duplicate a lot of roles and have that ready to go, because facing a shutdown is really what we found is really creating a harsh long-term effect where people are just saying, I'm going to wait until I know I can put my tickets to use. So we're in this, I think George referenced before, we can't really plan well. We like to plan and we like to have something that's predictable. Our subscriptions used to be something that would be predictable for the performing arts. Well, they're down by more than half. A lot of audience members are waiting to see. And that subscription revenue was stable revenue, which you could plan on. You could plan a season, especially if you're 18 to 24 months in advance, knowing what those revenue trends might be. Well, now it's hard to do and to take that risk. So we are still in a very interesting time with that audience. I think the quality of what you see on stage is second to none. It's just a matter for those routines to really come back. And the last thing I'll say around ticket pricing, and George referenced this as well, we're not in an environment where we could pass costs along through ticket prices. It doesn't work well. Higher ticket prices usually means there's less attendees. Many of our groups have tried even discount programs. It just still hasn't broken through some of that hesitancy. So raising ticket prices is not an answer for us. We just need more people coming back. And that's what's going to be a unique mix here going forward.
Maybe one more question here for both of you, and then we'll probably pivot to our audience Q&A. I do want to hear just a little more discussion about inflation, because it just seems like inflation now is yet another issue that's cropping up on the heels of all these issues of trying to get people more engaged and getting attendance back up. Now you have inflation coming roaring along here that I would suspect is having, and you guys can tell me if I'm right here, but is having an impact both in terms of the expenditure side and for organizations trying to make their budgets work, but also within households and families as they're making decisions about their discretionary dollars that they have for recreation and to be able to attend a play or whatever type of performing arts activity. How is inflation playing a role, and what are your thoughts about that kind of going forward?
Yeah, I just really quickly, I think it's going to be really tough. I think you hit the right note about the fact that as people feel the pain in their pocketbooks, I mean, it's going to be more challenging for folks to decide to sort of do the thing that Patrick talked about, which is to sort of get back into the routine of coming back downtown, paying for parking, going out. And I think that is the sort of ancillary economic impact of what the arts and culture sector brings to our communities, is not only vibrancy to places, right, whether it's downtown or in the neighborhoods, but also to bars, restaurants, like all of this, hotels, having people come in, travel into Milwaukee to see a show and to experience our summer festivals. I mean, all that stuff, all that economic churn, because of the inflationary pressures, I think is very real. And I think sort of moreover, as it relates to this is more on the human capital side, right? Like our ability to kind of ensure that our people stay in these organizations, to ensure that the programming is tip top and that they are run as excellent organizations and are able to continue to generate the kind of work that our community expects. So that's going to be a little bit more difficult as people start to consider their own careers and whether or not coming out of COVID they want to continue in this field, right? And so I think there's just a lot of inflationary pressures that our sector is going to be feeling. We're just at the beginning of it, right? I think these last few years have suggested that there's going to be a long tail to this pandemic, and I think you all had quoted, right, that we were the arts and culture sector would have been what was the first to close down and will be the last to fully recover. And I think some of the additional headwinds we are seeing as it relates to inflation, some of the macroeconomic issues that we're sailing into are going to be very real and very, very intense.
That's really interesting. Patrick, do you want to touch on that real quick as well?
Yeah, I'll appreciate what statement that David said earlier. The arts at the end of the day are about people. It's people that are performing for people. You're creating a connection. You're building a sense of community and empathy. And what's so important to this is that our artists feel that they have a livelihood, that they can be those full-time creative professionals that they are. We've prided ourselves on that in Milwaukee for a long time. We had roughly about, throughout the pandemic, our member organizations invested in people. They invested in their artists. There were 1,300 artists that were employed during the time frame of 2020 through 2021. That actually went down a little bit by about 6% in 21 to 22 as we saw that. And the concern is, will that have to go down even further as we reduce some of the other performance activities that we know that we do? I know one theater organization had last year programmed with 25 people on stage. It was very skeleton-like for what they were doing. Well, this season they have 5 different productions. They're looking at 14 actors on stage, and it's a way for them to manage through this time frame and this budget. They want to bring back as many professionals as possible. The dollars are just not there. And to David's point too, we're seeing that kind of burnout amongst the administrative staff as well. Many positions that are open. It's been rare where we see any type of raise amongst our administrative professionals right now. And they're moving to other sectors where their skills are in demand and they can command a much higher price for what they do. And I think George talked about that as well. Just the trades. The trades are essential to so much what happens, and they too are finding new avenues for work. So I think the challenge is going to be not only the people in the seats, but keep that great workforce that we have, especially the artists, if they can be full-time creatives. And that's the investment we want to make long-term.
Okay. We are going to shift now to the audience Q&A portion. I'm seeing a good volume of questions coming in now. So thank you to everyone for submitting those. And I'm going to pull this one here real quick. This is from a person who says that they are new to Wisconsin. They moved here from Michigan, and they're a new board member with their local arts center. They don't specify where that is, but somewhere here, presumably in Wisconsin. And they're working on doing some marketing for their local arts center. They're wondering if there's any sort of general, widely used recovery campaigns or materials for the arts that they can easily pull to kind of reference for their web content at their local arts center. This just seems like a very practical question that I wanted to see if anybody had any thoughts on any resources that this individual could use. This might be a small art center that doesn't have a lot of resources. Is there anything that they can use, any communications or just talking points or things that they can look to kind of reference for their local art center? George, do you want to take a crack at that one?
I would just say that reaching out to groups like Americans for the Arts, Create Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Presenters Network, this sort of affiliate groups that are going through this together, who may have created a campaign of their own or may have best practices about how to navigate through this stuff. Imagine MKE, another of those kinds of groups that can be helpful to helping people navigate, not necessarily because they have a grand campaign, but because they're listening to their constituencies and can forward information and best practice to them. So,
and we did just get a follow-up from this person. They're up in Marshfield, joining us from Marshfield. So that's great. Obviously a lot of our discussion is focused on Milwaukee today, but we know we have a lot of people tuning in from various parts of the state who are involved with arts organizations throughout Wisconsin. So we really appreciate that. We have sort of several questions here that I might just sort of roll together because they all sort of tie into this issue of public support for the arts and how Wisconsin does lag in that category. I'm interested to hear, particularly, I kind of asked this question of you, George, but I'd be interested to hear from Patrick and David. And obviously, I'm sure your thoughts and your focus are going to be more Southeast Wisconsin specific, but what are your thoughts in terms of whether there's an opportunity to kind of move the needle, either it's at the state level or maybe for you, it's more Milwaukee local government. What are your thoughts about how a coalition can be put together to really make the case to policymakers that we need to have more public funding for arts and culture?
Yeah. So
David, yeah.
Yeah. So I think one thing that I think the folks in Milwaukee know, because we've been talking about it a lot, is that the city and county of Milwaukee invest 0.02% of their annual budgets in programmatic arts investments, right? Like the county does a little better because of the investments in the buildings, but on program, it's 0.02%. That is a tiny, tiny amount. what we found in Chicago, which obviously is hard to compare, but even in Madison, right? Like some similar cities, the average percentage is about 0.3% of annual budgets. So that's a whole tenth. That's a whole decimal point over. And so for us here in Milwaukee City and County, 0.3% of our annual budgets would be somewhere around $9 million, eight or $9 million. That doesn't get us all the way there, but it is a start, right? And I think that Patrick and I were just talking about this very issue a couple of days ago. That like, as we think about like what the number is, it almost could be any number because we're so poorly leveraged right now in the context of public funding for the arts here in Milwaukee that anything would be an improvement. I think insofar as a coalition, I think our challenge here in Milwaukee is, as the Public Policy Forum knows, is that we have a real difficulty in determining our own future insofar as revenue. And I think our city and county's challenges in terms of budget is also very real, right? I'm realistic in sort of talking to my coalition about what's possible, but I think articulating the possibility that we could have a region where institutions are no longer here, and that becomes a challenge for some of our larger employers to attract talent. I think that's a real path for us, and I think being able to determine and articulate that value is an important sort of next step for us, right? Like, what does it mean to have this this jewel of a ecosystem here in the Upper Midwest, of arts and culture groups that really provide connection, inspiration, talent attraction, and tourist attraction to our state.
And Mark, let me just ask David to reflect on something, and that's neighborhoods. So we're talking about the arts organizations, we're talking about that sort of great institution that we have, but we're not talking about the neighborhoods and where the support for what's going on in neighborhoods across Milwaukee and across the state are being supported. So how is that going as we look at creating this coalition, creating the dollars that are coming through?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think Milwaukee has some challenges insofar as how some of its neighborhoods feel connected to each other, right? And throughout our city. And I think the arts community has been incredible over the last few years in standing up reciprocal programming back and forth with our community neighbors, right? With our friends and neighbors throughout our county, throughout our city and county. I think what's unique about arts and culture and creativity, though, is that it is abundant and it is everywhere. And we are working with some of our neighborhood groups and some of our arts partners to platform some of those stories. And I think insofar as how we can, and this is sort of our work as a coalition, right? Like how we can sort of help articulate the on-the-ground impact of arts and culture activations in our neighborhoods is I think for me a pathway towards success, right? The mayor here in Milwaukee just announced a pilot artist in residence program at the city, which is magnificent. And one of the things that they're looking at is how arts can affect one of the key civic issues here in our region, which is traffic safety, public safety, right? And there are great stories from across the nation about how arts can drive key civic priorities, and we're beginning to sort of figure out how to work on that here in Milwaukee. So that's actually very exciting. Thanks for queuing that up, George.
You bet.
I could just make one comment to this too, and it's sort of what I was talking from public support. There's been incredible private investment in our city and county in the infrastructure for our arts organizations. Just as I look at UPAF members, there's roughly in the past about 7 years now, $250 million worth of private funding that's been going into creating places like the Bradley Symphony Center, like the expanded Milwaukee Youth Arts Center, like the Baumgartner Center for Dance, and now with the Milwaukee Rep doing their renovations of the Quadracci Powerhouse and expanding that. This is predominantly private support investing in our community. And every time we do that, all this economic activity happens around it. West Wisconsin Avenue, because of the Bradley Symphony Center planting a flag there to say they're going to do that, we have seen tremendous growth with the Avenue, with restaurants, expansion of the convention center. All these things are now coming about because of that one investment. We scale back, 30 years ago, we look at the investment done in the Third Ward. By that time, Skyline Music Theater These were abandoned warehouses turned into the arts as the catalyst to change an entire area, with now condominiums and growth, and one of the largest condominiums that's going to be built in Milwaukee just a few years from now. The arts, as we take a long-term view, 5, 10, 20 years beyond that initial investment, creates so much economic vitality for our communities. And at the end of the day, we can't just build the buildings. We need to sustain the organizations that are in those facilities. And that's what we're talking about right now. The investments at this point in time and the changes we make are going to prepare us for the next 20 years, because the capital investment is already there.
Patrick, maybe just a quick follow-up here. That this strikes me as a good one, maybe for you to address. It's a pretty specific question here from one of our audience members. They're wondering, and we mentioned earlier, possibly near record levels of state budget surpluses. There's going to be a lot of conversations about that. This person has kind of a specific idea of sales tax. Is there a chance, or would it be helpful if sales tax were potentially eliminated for nonprofit arts groups or just other types of arts and cultural institutions? Is that something that would be a realistic possibility that would be helpful, in terms of as they're dealing with all these issues that we've kind of been discussing?
So, I mean, the answer to that is it has been tried. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be tried again, but the Milwaukee Rep, the Milwaukee Symphony have been down this path to try to get the state to consider dropping the sales tax from tickets for arts organizations. It does put a cap on what can be charged, right? Because if you go and find in states that don't have that sales tax, you've got a little bit more room to move that that ticket price. But with the sales tax included, that becomes an issue. So can it be done? Sure. Is it palatable? It certainly is palatable to one side of the aisle who says we don't want to have taxes, right? So if we're looking for a winning argument, that's an argument that can be made there. However, on the other side, we're always talking about, do we want to give up revenue to the state? And so there will be those politicians who say, yeah, we can't give up another dime, and we certainly don't want an industry defining where those dollars will go. So it's something that should be considered, as perennially considered, and might find a sympathetic ear at some point.
Yeah, I think the interesting part here is the pressure that we continue to place on private support to fund the structure, the financial structures of the arts that we know, be it in Milwaukee or be it anywhere in the state. There needs to be a better public solution, is what it comes down to. That's just where we're facing. And I think, to George's point, I think many of those private leaders who have been such a long-term source of funding, their voice in this process is going to make a big difference in terms of the value of the public sector support as well.
We're just going to do one more question here before we wrap up. And this is one that I'll maybe start with you, David, because you kind of mentioned this, but all three, you might have thoughts about this. You mentioned the possibility that, the events of the last 2.5 years could really have a long tail for arts and cultural organizations. And I suspect that many organizations, as any organization probably is when they're in crisis mode, you kind of deal with what's right in front of you, right? You kind of go day to day and you work your way through the crisis. And maybe there hasn't been a lot of time for these organizations to think about long-term impacts because they've been managing a lot of these short-term emergency issues. But what do you see long-term? What are some potential long-term impacts that you see, and how can our arts and cultural sector, while they've clearly got their hands full here dealing with the present, start to wrap their arms around what the long-term could hold?
Yeah, thanks for that, Mark. I really think that the future of our region's arts, cultural, and creative sector is really in the creative industries that our nonprofit arts and culture groups are a segment of, right? Like, these are good paying 21st century jobs that, really leverage on a community and a person's creativity, which, as we know, is hopefully the last thing that the machines will come for, right? Insofar as automation. And these are the kinds of people that Milwaukee needs if we're going to hit that 1 million person goal that the mayor has set out, right, for building a million population in Milwaukee. And so how do we build our creative industries, right? Whether that's in film or music or some of the more kind of the industries that have large umbrella effects, right, or large sort of corollary effects, right? Because a film industry brings in not only actors, not only tourism, but also employs local electricians, employs people to drive people around. Like it provides a lot of ancillary jobs for our community, right? So really thinking about how the arts and culture sector is less about traditional arts funding, but really more about job creation and economic and community vibrancy and health, I think is one of the key areas that we need to move in. And I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier too, right? Like how our arts and culture community, and I know this is tough, right? Because we've been managing a lot of stuff, but how does it integrate in civic priorities of our city and county, right? The county executive in 2020, right, made a goal of making Milwaukee the healthiest county in Wisconsin. Arts and culture has a unique role in creating that and helping drive that, right? It's not going to be the sole thing, but it can be a useful lever. And I think for us to figure out how we bring our stakeholders in to be a thoughtful partner to make that happen, I think is a real opportunity for us.
George, Patrick, any more thoughts on that?
Patrick, anything?
I'm just going to speak just a last statement here about the arts and its purpose and role in community. There's something here about the fact that 1 out of every 5 performances that our members do is free and open to the public, and they're going. And George referenced before, they're going into the communities and they're partnering with other organizations. The Milwaukee Ballet has this wonderful program called Ballet Beat, where for the last 3 weeks, they've been all throughout different parts of our city that don't have that same type of exposure involvement with the arts in their own neighborhoods. And this is the time frame when we start talking about that future. Those are things that we lose first. And those are the soul of the mission of our organizations, is to connect people through the arts and with the arts. It's not always going to be paid. We know that. We want to reach out to the community. We want to reach out with our youth in our community. Over 160,000 youth have exposure to the arts, mainly because these organizations exist and they put that program in the schools. So that's what we're facing right now. Those are the things that we lose first. And we wonder, why did we lose it? Well, it was because we had to start somewhere. And that's what you start seeing, is those losses of community connection and having that involvement of the arts everywhere we are. And at the end of the day, that's our mission. And that's what we want to deliver more of.
So for me, we're going to just talk about cultural resources in the way we talk about natural resources. And we've been talking about what could happen if we're not nurturing our cultural resources. Gloom and doom ensue, right? But we can also think about it as the kids in the schools are part of our cultural resources. They may not grow up to be artists, but they're going to learn visual art or dance or music. It may keep them in school. It may help them create a habits of mind that will make them great in whatever it is they're going to do. And I think what we have to be able to say to people is, remember the pandemic, don't forget, because you picked up the instrument you didn't play since you were a kid because you needed something to make it through. You read books, you wrote poetry, you did all these artistic things that either connected you to yourself, but also connected you to others who cared about the things you cared about. So the arts, we've talked about many, many different roles that they've played during this pandemic time and going forward. And I just, to echo my fellow panelists, the bottom line is it can't be taken for granted. Like the environment that we're all moving to try to save and make sure that we have a sustainable environmental future, we need the same. We need to be active and intentional about making sure that we have a robust, resilient, and sustainable cultural future throughout the state of Wisconsin.
That's a great way to wrap things up, George. Thank you so much for that. And we are several minutes past 1:30 here, so we do need to bring things to a close. I want to apologize to everyone who we weren't able to get your question answered here. We did actually have quite an outpouring, especially at the very end, so we weren't able to get to all the questions, but we had some really good ones, and thank you to everybody who submitted them. Obviously, just a huge thank you to our guests, David Lee, Patrick Rath, George Zugros. Thank you all so much for joining us for what I thought was a really interesting discussion today. And I would just close to say that, throughout the polarized times that we're in right now, the Wisconsin Policy Forum maintains our commitment to the highest level of nonpartisan public policy research that we hope will inform policymaking in critical areas. We would urge you to stay tuned for more forum research in the weeks to come. I do want to plug very quickly a few upcoming forum events. After a lengthy, more than 2-year long pandemic-related hiatus, we are, knock on wood here, hopeful that our Policy in a Pub event series is going to be making a comeback here very soon. We're hoping in September in Milwaukee. We will have more details that we'll be sharing through our communications channels on that soon. We're just nailing that down now, but to anybody who's listening now, we would love to see you at that event. We're also hopefully working on a similar event that we would like to hold in Madison, potentially in October. So stay tuned for that as well if you're tuning into us from the Dane County area. And then certainly our salute to local government. That's really our banner event every year, our annual recognition of excellence in the state and local public sector. In Wisconsin, that's going to be held November 16th at the Italian Community Center in Milwaukee. And you can certainly learn more about that by visiting our website, wispolicyforum.org. Of course, we do have to ask, if you're listening today and you're not a member of the forum, please, we ask that you do consider joining. Membership lets you know whenever we release research, invitations to our events, and the ability to help shape our research agenda by serving on one of our various policy committees that are linked to the different subject matters of our research. And of course, most importantly, it makes you part of the group of civic-minded individuals, organizations, and businesses that make our work possible and that really care very deeply about Wisconsin and its communities. You can go to our website again to learn more, or you can certainly follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. We have very active accounts on all those platforms. And that concludes our program for today. Thank you to all of our audience members for tuning in, and we hope to see you at the next Forum Friday at a date and time to be announced soon. Thanks to everyone.